Hi Hires, so we are still looking at how you can avoid adverse conditions, and we're going for one very specific way of avoiding them, and that is migration. So if you're not going to go into a form of dormancy, you could go drastically the other way. You could just say, you know what, it's becoming far too hot or far too cold or far too something else, but just not okay for you, and you could just move. Move entirely somewhere different where you have a better condition for all your enzymes and all your metabolism. If it's a regular movement of a species from one place to another, that's a migration. And there are lots of them. We know for lots and lots of different species. Okay, so why do this in the first place? Why actually put effort into migrating? And it's just to avoid the environmental stress of being somewhere which is out with your tolerance curve, or is just creeping up on being out with your tolerance curve. So temperature, especially if you're an endotherm, water regulation, food scarcity, all of these things. The cost is in move, and so that would be like if you're flying, that obviously is an energy that you have to put into flying, but it's balanced off by the benefit of where you end up, and you end up in more favourable conditions, which will allow you to get the energy back effectively. So there are some super impressive migrations in the animal kingdom, like genuinely spectacularly. You have salmon moving, over almost 4,000 kilometers, and dragonflies actually migrate over several generations. So it's not even just the ones that set off don't make it, but over 4 generations they get to their migration path, and then that's huge. And then we have the Arctic tern, one of the most impressive ones, because it does an annual round trip of 71,000 kilometers. It's crazy amounts. A kind of better picture of the Arctic tern. This picture on the globe shows you where they go, and they basically go up at full distance across the globe and back. Really impressive. So how do you actually keep track of what's going on? And you need to be able to give some examples of how you might track migration. And they're all kind of obvious ones, I think. You would know a lot of these. So long distance trackers are good. You can either collect the trackers later and download everything that's there, or you can have trackers that will kind of ping in real time. You can have GPS trackers. They're great, but they're quite heavy and they're quite expensive, so you use them on bigger animals. And you have other ones as well, other forms, kind of like a GPS but uses a different system. They're not as heavy, but they're not as accurate as GPS, so you have to decide on how you might want to do this. So trackers are good. Here's a nice little picture of tracking of a snowy owl. I put this one in just because I think this is just very amusing. So this is a bunch of Russian scientists that were tracking eagles, and they were using transmitters that sent basically a text message which gave their data of where they were. The problem is that they went further than they expected them to, and this particular eagle, Min, went out with of the area they expected, flew to Iran from Kazakhstan, and then was in Kazakhstan for a whole pile of the time, nowhere near the mobile network. And when it came back into Iran, it basically dumped a huge backlog of messages, so much that basically she used up the entire tracking budget for all the eagles. They had to set up like a GoFundMe page to try and get their stuff worked out. I thought that was just amusing. Okay, you can attach tags. Again, radio transmitters this time rather than a GPS. They tends to mean that you have to wander around trying to find them, but that can be useful if you know where you're likely to get them. You can use different sensors. You can use light sensors. They can get really small. Okay, you can get to very small chips that you can use for them now. You can use tags like banding or ringing. You may have seen birds with bands on their legs, and the nice thing about some of the birds with the bands that you can actually don't even need to recapture. You can take a picture of them, or you can look at them, and you can actually, as long as you can see the leg bands, you can make a call. But you might have to recapture just so you can see what's going on with them. Certainly things like butterflies you might need to, and this is actually getting placed with the tag on that. This is just a picture showing some of the tags that you might use in fish. As I say, there are just so many different ways that you could do this. And you have the kind of old school version, like you might just actually know what they look like. So there are very specific tails for whales that you can, if you know what you're looking at, you can say this is where they were. And you can have bird watchers that are looking for specific individuals, particular species. They know them by the patterns and where they arrive. What we now know is that migration is super complicated, kind of obvious, but actually it's got two parts to it. There is innate behaviour. That means something that you are born with. Okay, it's inherited, you have it, that's it, it's there, it's instinctive. But it also has learned behaviour, where you basically are taught things about what's going on. And migration is a combination of this, and that makes it really quite important that you have populations that can maintain what's going on. So the trigger is part of the innate. So the trigger is something that you instinctively start when something hits a particular temperature, a particular day length, that triggers the migration behaviour. Quite often a photoperiod, so that's a day length one, and then that sets you off. If the trigger gets out of sync with the seasons, that's a real problem, and yet again climate change could be part of this. Okay, this is a very interesting article from a few years ago about golden eagle migration. I would say just pause the video and read this through. Absolutely fascinating, really interesting, quite worrying. Okay, so as well as that innate part, we then have the learned part, and the learned part is because routes can be quite complicated. There will be very, very specific stopping points. So we will have routes that will follow very particular ones for each migratory species. Quite often we're looking at birds. And they did some kind of pretty horrible things actually. Took birds before migration and just seeing where they went if you took them from where they would normally start. So what we mean by this is, if you had a bird that was normally started here and they went in this direction for their migration route, and then what they did was they took these birds and they moved them to here, and what they discovered is they went like that, not like that. So the initial direction seemed to be part of their learning. And then they fostered birds for different species that migrate and see what they do. And it all backs up this idea that learning and innate are mixed together. There's triggers and there's some things they don't need to learn, but there's some things they do. I'll just leave the cartoon there, but now we're done.